Hello everybody and welcome to Class 9 of Premiere 202, Premiere Pro for the Filmmaker. This class we're going to talk a little bit about how to export your project now that we have gone through all these different steps, and a little bit about the project manager, and we're going to do a little bit of round-trip workflow briefly in Final Cut and Premiere. This will wrap up the class on the model BTS, and the last class we'll do a little red workflow and some stabilization and time remapping. So we kind of went through this entire class and edit and step by step got to the final part of exporting. But before we export, I just want to show you a couple more cool tricks and tips of what you can do with Premiere, and especially some of you guys coming from Final Cut, how you can go back and forth between the two. So I just simply imported a couple clips into Final Cut onto a sequence here. And so these are just two clips back to back, and you can see I can even make a couple cuts in here and rearrange some of this stuff around. And I just want to show that these simple edits can be brought back and forth between Final Cut and Premiere. So what I'm going to do is come to File, Export, and I'm going to export a XML. And these settings are fine as is, and you want to click OK. I'm going to navigate to my James folder here under Projects, Final Cut Pro, and I'll just call this Test Final Cut Pro to Premiere. Go ahead and save that out. Come to Premiere, and all you have to do is open that up. So just come under Projects, Premiere, Final Cut, and we'll open up that XML and open up that folder and have a new sequence. And here you see those are our cuts and edits, just as we saw them, just as we left them off in Final Cut. So that seems great, but I'll show you what happens when we take our final edit here and try to bring it to Final Cut, or even if we had a final edit in Final Cut and brought it to Premiere. It's not absolutely perfect, but if you're doing rough cuts, it's actually, really, really handy. So I tell a lot of people they want to do their full edit in Final Cut, but there's simple things just to rough cut or just to test. We'll see in the last class how easy it is to test red footage and just to see where you're at, or even F3. I have a lot of friends that, we shoot a lot of F3 at our post-production house, and a lot of times Cleet or John and the guys I work with will go through a ton of hassle to get the F3 footage into Final Cut, when instead they could just drag and drop it in Premiere and see what clips or see how the footage looks if it's properly exposed and move on. It's a lot of formats are like that. So what I'm going to do is just show how you would send from Premiere to Final Cut, and you would go to File, Export, Final Cut Pro XML. Go ahead and save it. And I'm just going to call this in the same Final Cut Pro folder, Test Premiere to Final Cut Pro. Now it's going to come with this translation report. Right off the bat, there's going to be something wrong, and it's because we have tons of effects in here. We have, I'll just click OK there. We have, this Adobe Media Encoder round trip to After Effects here that Final Cut's definitely not going to, or the dynamic link that Final Cut's definitely not going to recognize. But we can still see where we're at, and we come to File, Import XML in Final Cut. And right down here, you'll see the Test Premiere to Final Cut. Open that up. I don't have to change any settings here either. Just click OK and let that load up. And it doesn't take that long. Click yes. Well, that just shows the error log. And come under your sequences and double click on your final edit, and we'll see how we did. One cool thing about this, though, is even if you don't get a perfect sequence, you still have all of your stuff brought in very easily in the same order, nice and neat, which is really, really cool. So you can think of some good workflows if you want to do certain things in Final Cut, but other things in Premiere. You just have to be smart about how you do it. So you can see that's offline there. But all our clips are in the right order. Everything's pretty much where we expect it. One other thing that was not doing very well here is our photos. And our photos are just way too zoomed in here. And so it's just like it, didn't accept those right. But that's as simple as coming in here and, fixing these things one by one, if you have to, on the scale and stuff, until it matches what it was supposed to match in Premiere. So, if an editor only works in one or the other, you can at least get them part of the way there. You can see the keyframes are all not where they're supposed to be. So I'm going to go ahead and close Final Cut because I barely use the program anymore. It's actually funny how once I've used a little bit of everything, Final Cut, Avid, and Premiere, but once you take a step away for a year from a program, it's crazy how muscle memory kicks in on the other one and you just can't remember back and forth how to use one. But yeah, I'm definitely more at home right now with using Premiere for the most part. Some other cool things that you can do in the export process is a lot of the times the client wants screen grabs, just email them, or to put on even Vimeo for the web of your video, and the fastest way to do that is right in Premiere as well. And so you can kind of come frame by frame until you find just a really nice moment, and you select this little export frame box over here. And you can select between JPEG, a DPX, TIFF, Target, PNG. I'll just say JPEG, and I will call this Model 01. And let's go ahead and make a new folder under here called Screen Grabs. And I'll actually put that under my final renders instead. I'll make a folder in there called Screen Grabs. Let me clean that up while I'm thinking about it. I'll delete this one. And so I will click choose and then go ahead and click OK. And it's just as simple as that, and I can do that a couple more times here. See if I like any other shots. That's a nice one right there. And let's call this Model 02. You can see how quick this is, just going through one by one. Let's see, it's a nice one. Model 3, and then maybe one at the beginning here. Something like this, showing them getting ready. And now I can actually come under that folder, final renders, screen grabs, and here I have a couple screen grabs that I can send off. And the cool thing about this, if I actually open one of these up and come under Tools, Show Inspector, it's the full 1920 by 1080 image, so it's ready to go without any kind of weird artifacts or cropping that might be done if you try to screen grab it another way. So it's just a nice, quick, easy way to do that. So now that we have that all established, the thing I want to show you before we start to export is something that comes in handy a lot of the time on massive projects like this. So you went to all this hard work to get everything organized and everything's in one place, but you want to make sure it's backed up and archived this way. And if you're handing this off to another person, or you have to send it off somewhere else for animation or graphics or color, you don't want to send them everything if you don't have to. So a nice way to be able to collapse this project down and get it to somebody for either archival or for further post-production is to use what's called the project manager. And so the project manager is a really great tool, and we worked really hard during this project, and I went over and over again and stressed the very importance of getting everything under this one folder. But a lot of people are not that organized, or you might not have gotten everything centralized, And that's another great use for the project manager, is if you have stuff all over your hard drive, it'll consolidate it all. I highly recommend, once again, keeping things organized from the start. It just makes it easier, but this is always a safe way to make sure everything gets where it needs to in the end if you have to do like a quick edit on something and you have to just throw stuff around. So I wish there was a uncheck or check all kind of box, but really the first thing I do is find the one I want, which is the final edit. I don't need all these other sequences, and then I just uncheck everything else around it. And one by one, these are all of my old sequences that I don't need anymore, that I don't want to bring with me. So a couple things under this box. You have your final edit, and then you have collect files and copy to a new location, or create new trim project. So I never really trust the create new trim project. What it's basically doing is taking your QuickTime files or your ProRes files or whatever files you have, and it's trimming the tail ends of it, the front and the end, and trying to make things bigger, or is trimming certain things. I just would rather take all my files and copy them one by one, and that way I know nothing is compromised during that procedure. So collect files and copy new locations, what I'll keep. There's some checkboxes down here: include preview files and include audio conform files. I always like to keep these unchecked. The more you check here, the more work the Premiere is trying to do in the background, and the more it could get corrupted. Sometimes I've had projects, the bigger the project, the harder project manager is to organize it all, especially if you're trying to do trim projects and checking all these boxes. Same thing with the rename media files to match clip names. I keep this unchecked as well. And that really seems to work the best for me for what I've tested in the past. And so keeping this whole thing as simple as possible will always work more in the end. So you can see I just hit the calculate button and it went from 27 gigs down to 7 gigs. That's a 20 gigabyte difference that I will take any day. So all I have to do now is browse to where I want this to go, and I've already set up a folder under called Media Manager, and that's what I'll select. I'll hit choose and I'll click OK. And what this is doing in the background is it's basically going to analyze what we have here, and then it's going to start to copy the media. And if I come over here, I can actually start to see what it's doing in the background. And if I come under Media Manager, here's your folder, and here one by one it's going to start copying every single clip that I used in this project, including the photos and the video files, and then it's finally going to make one big sequence of everything at once. So that's a really handy thing. Now, one thing that I recommend highly is, especially if you're doing this on 2 drives, so say I did this on this drive and then I would copy it to my desktop to have a backup of everything, I always eject the original drive and make sure that it's unplugged from my computer, and then I'll open up the new project file it makes, say on the desktop for instance, and I'll just make sure that everything's online, that there's no media offline issues. And as long as that's the case, everything will be okay, and you'll know you can go ahead and copy and paste that to other locations if you need to. I'm not going to let this go the whole way through, but it's working fine. I'm going to go ahead and cancel out of this. One thing I wanted to show everybody is you can run into a situation where media does come offline under a project. Let's go ahead and take this card B. I'm just going to make a new folder called test, and I'm just going to drag all of my media into there. And so there we go. It's going to ask where those files are. So I'm just going to cancel, and this is what the media offline looks like. You can see everything has disappeared, and you might open a project sometime with this asking you where everything's at. So what you have to do most of the time is go ahead and close this project out, go ahead and save it, and then what you want to do is open it back up. So your Media Manager pops open like this. So it's going to ask where's that first file. As long as you can find that first file, that's always the key, and it'll be able to find the rest of them for you. So go ahead and open that file, and then it's going to go ahead and locate the rest of the media in the project for you and sync everything back up. But you can see, just as simple as me moving a folder into another folder could be a very scary process, and you want to make sure that's why your naming conventions are proper, and that's why you make sure you have everything kind of in the right hierarchy and you're not moving a bunch of things around afterwards, because that'll just kind of screw things up in the long run. So you can see now that everything was brought back in, that it's all linked back up just like it was, and it found all that media, but it lost all of my renders. So it's just one of those situations that you have to be really careful about while you're moving media around, but I just wanted to show you how you would link those things back up and sync them. And render it all back out. Okay, so now that everything's rendered back out like it was before, I just wanted to make sure everybody was aware of how to get media that was offline back online. But you really want to make sure you do render your entire sequence before you export it. I don't know if that's something that is you have to do, but I like to do it and I recommend it. It's never failed for me that way. And so the other thing you want to make sure you do is, once again, I map my workspace in and out bars to the left and right brackets. And so I just want to set those to the left and the right to make sure those are all set properly. And I'm pretty much ready to go and export this now. So I just want to save it one more time. Actually, a good trick is to come under File, Save As. Save this as version 11. And I want to make sure my sequence is Final Edit. Make sure I'll just close out those other ones. And I could always duplicate my sequence, but I know I set this up just for the final edit. And I'm ready to go to File, Export Media. And so to wrap up this class, it's really important to know the different types of ways to export. So, a lot of people export to the web using H.264, or exporting to ProRes 422 or 422HQ for an uncompressed archive. Or if you don't have Final Cut installed or the ProRes codecs, you can always export an animation, QuickTime animation. So if you come under Format here, there's a bunch of different formats that you can choose from. One format is JPEG, which we showed a better way to do over here. You have H.264, which I highly recommend you do not use. I recommend you use QuickTime wrapper with a H.264 codec instead of an H.264 wrapper. This seems to have more issues with certain things that I've run into in the past, where this is pretty solid. And then you have your MPEG-2s and your P2s in different formats. So we'll just stick with QuickTime. And what I want to do is come under my video codec here. I'm going to start with H.264. Let's say I'm going to send to Vimeo or YouTube or something like that. I'm going to keep my quality at 100 and my width at 1920 and my height at 1080 and my frame rate at 23.976. And it's important that I change my square pixel or my aspect ratio for 2 square pixels if it's on something else. Then another trick that a lot of people don't set by default, because Premiere for some reason doesn't set this by default, is the keyframe every. And I want to set to every 24 frames and make sure that's checked. And then I want to limit my data rate to 10,000 kilobits per second or 10 megabits per second. You can always set this to 40,000 kilobits per second, and that'll be closer to like a Blu-ray style quality, but 10,000 is more than enough for what we're doing here. Oops. Make sure that gets set back. And I want to make sure that my audio is set to AAC and 4,800 hertz here, 48,000 hertz or 4,800 kilohertz. Now, when I have all this stuff exactly like I want, there's FTP settings and filters, which I never really use, but once this is all set, you can come under and save this as a preset. And I'm going to call this QuickTime H.264 1080p at 10,000 kilobits per second. And just to double check this is all right, if you go between the source and the output, you can check to make sure that it matches, everything looks fine. Let's say, for instance, that I set my square pixel aspect ratio to D1 DVNTSC 0.9. If I come to output, you'll see black lines on the top and the bottom, and that means something was done improperly. So it's always just a good way to check to make sure that your source will match your output no matter what. If you have a resolution wrong or something like that, that'll make sure you're on the right track. So I'm just going to come back under my preset here, and I'm going to come under class 8. Oops, I'm going to come under my fix PhD. Here we go, change the model shoot, and my final renders. And then I'm going to call this model BTS final, and I'm going to click save. Actually, I'm going to call this BTS Final 2 because I already have one set up here that I rendered out earlier. And that one's ready to go. Now, what else? The other things I want to show you is there's two ways you can go ahead and export out this project. You can either export it all out of Premiere, which will tie up Premiere and allow you, pretty much make you stop working in Premiere. Or you can set up a queue and it'll open up Adobe Media Encoder. So one thing I like to do sometimes, depending, I find they're both great workarounds, but normally I'll just export in Premiere because I'll be done. But the queue is a great thing to do if you want to do batch exports, which I'll talk about now. So we set up one for Vimeo. Let's do another one. Let's say we want to do one for 1280 by 720. Nothing else really needs to change besides the resolution. And I'm going to save this as another preset. We'll call it QuickTime H.264. Still call this 720p. Click OK. And so now we have the two different versions. We have 1080 and we have 720. So you can go back and forth between the two and make sure everything's good. Come up to custom and make another one for ProRes 422 at 1080p, obviously, because we want it to be highest as we can. And you see that these things are grayed out now, which just goes to show that it's going by the ProRes defaults. And I want to go under audio this time and change it to uncompressed, and that way we have uncompressed audio coming out, because this is going to be more of our archive preset. And so now I'm just going to call this QuickTime ProRes 422 1080p, and I'll take off the bitrate because we don't need that. And now I have these different versions. I have my 1080p version, H.264, my 720 version of H.264, and my 1080p version with uncompressed audio. And I can do one more here if I want to. And this is if you don't have ProRes through Final Cut. You can use an animation codec or the Apple Intermediate codec. Either one. They're both very they have very high file sizes, but they will work for the most part, especially for final renders. They work very well. And so what you want to do here is 1080p version of it, and audio. This time I want to make sure it's uncompressed. And everything else looks good here. Now we just want to save this out as QuickTime Animation 1080p, and we'll take off this again there. Alright, and then now we still have our other ones here set up, ProRes 720p. You always want to go back through and make sure these are all accurate, and I'll show you why in a second. So we're going to start with our, let's just do an H.264 720p. This will be sent to Vimeo. And it even tells you the bottom, the estimated file size that these will be. So you can see some of them won't show you. I don't think the ProRes shows either, but the H.264s will show you. So let's go 720p. And what we're going to do is we could export this now. I'm going to go here, or we could queue it up. So I'm going to head it to the queue. What this is going to do is going to prepare the data for the export, and it's going to open up the Adobe Media Encoder. And so once you set this up, it's fairly convenient because you can keep working inside Premiere and keep editing other projects or other things that you need to work on or you can go grab a coffee and render out 4 or 5 different versions for different clients or for different outputs all at one time. So once Adobe Media Encoder launches, it'll take a little bit, and then up pops your final edit. So what I want to do is right click, and I want to duplicate this a couple times, and one more, and then all I have to do is come under my preset. I'll do one at animation, I'll do one at 1080p, and I'll do one at ProRes. And that's why I listed all these out, so you can quickly see at a glance. And it's automatically going to rename them all for you properly, and then once that's all done, you just hit the play button up here to start the queue, and it's going to go ahead one by one and start to export those for you in the proper folder, and you can go take a break. The last thing I want to show you in this class is another really critical thing you should always do after exporting before you ever send it off to a client or to the web is to verify your files. And it's just as simple as coming under your final renders, and I have this model BTS file I already exported earlier. It uses a 1280 by 720p, and what you should do here is come under Show Movie Inspector, and you want to make sure that everything matches up. So 9.56 megabits per second is the same thing as 10,000 kilobits per second. It's a variable bit rate, so it'll be somewhere in between there. 1280 by 720 pixels are the actual pixels, and your final file size and your frame rate, and it even shows you in here what your audio looks like, and everything matches up. So last thing you want to do is play it back and make sure everything is accurate.
Hey guys, I'm James Douglas. We're here in my downtown studio photographing a bunch of models, some stylists, and some makeup artists, and we're here and we're having a great time in the studio and doing some good work. We're having some fun today, huh? Try to have fun with everybody on set, and you connect to them, and you know these are people that hopefully want to be the kind of guy that you guys are going to call up and have, not only for jobs but just for beers and to hang out and, hey man, what are you doing today? I always try and have that connection with everybody that I'm working with, and you have that rapport and that balance, and you can really start talking to them. That's when you get your really, really good photographs.
All right. Well, it looks all right. So that concludes Class 9 and our Model BTS portion. I just want to stress the importance of watching this clip several times, 3, 4, 5 times. Be picky. One time listen to the audio, one time watch the grade, one time you watch it, just, watch to make sure the motion fits and it works. And there's nothing wrong with going back and making tweaks before you send this off to the world or to your clients. So really scrutinize every last cut, every last little bit of audio, and make sure there's no, extreme bad cut or, bad compression or whatnot, and you'll be set. And so I hope everybody enjoyed. These will keep in the queue, and I'll send you guys a version of this. And next week we'll come back with our last class and take a little bit of a break, obviously, because we're done with this project, and talk a little bit about Red workflow and how to stabilize some really cool RC helicopter footage from Snap Roll Media. And then we'll wrap up with doing some time remapping in Premiere, which is a really powerful, handy tool. So if you have any questions in the forums, please send them my way. I look forward to seeing some more of everybody's edits with the footage that we sent and see how everybody else's work came out. Thanks so much for everything, and talk to you guys next week.